afternoon, everyone. Can people hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Professor.
Oh, thanks, Sandra. Great. Well, welcome, everyone. Thanks to those of you who could make it today, and thanks to those of you who are joining online via Zoom. For those who are joining via Zoom, we have an audience of just over 10 people, so we look forward to having a discussion at the end of the seminar. Before I begin and introduce the speaker today, just wanted to say a special thanks to our partner in this labor seminar study series. We operate this seminar series jointly with the Frederick Ebert Stiftung, FES South Africa, and as always, we're very grateful for their support and their enthusiasm for this labor study seminar and various other activities that we undertake at NALSU. My name is Mike Rogan. I'm based at the Department of Economics and Economic History, and I'm a member of the NALSU team. NALSU itself is a partnership between the Department of Economics and Economic History and the Department of Sociology and Industrial Sociology and the Department of History. So we've always aimed to have an interdisciplinary approach to the study of labor markets, organized labor, and development issues in general. So today we're quite fortunate to have someone who's very well known to us talk about the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, a fairly appropriate topic since yesterday was a national shutdown organized two of the large labor federations that we have today. So with that sort of in mind, it would be interesting to look back at the history and formation of another initiative by organized labor in South Africa. Lucien is very well known to us. He's the director of NALSU. He's a sociologist by training and a labor educator. Some of his recent manuscripts include Anarchism and Syndicalism in the Colonial and Post-Colonial World, 1880 to 1940. Politics at a Distance from the State, which we launched just before the COVID pandemic here, Radical and African Perspectives. Also recently, Labor Struggles in Southern Africa, 1919 to 1939, New Perspectives on the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, which I think will tie together with today's seminar. The format will be, as always, about 40 minutes of presentation and then roughly 20 minutes of discussion and question and answer time after that. So welcome again to those of you joining via Zoom, and we hope you'll be able to participate in the discussion segments as well. Lucien, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks for coming. I also recognize that it's a study break, or some call it a back, at university, so some commitment. So it's really nice to have you here. What I'm going to do here is talk about the ICU. The full name is the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa. And with that in mind, I'm going to have to give some introduction to what this union was. I want to emphasize a bit about why it was an important organization. I also want to locate this in the context of the larger literature about the ICU. Now, the ICU really starts to be studied in the 1960s, and there's quite a lot of literature, and it fades away in the late 1980s. Dennis, you're going to do the admissions.
Yes.
It fades away in the late 1980s, but there's a new body of work. So one of the things that Mike mentioned is I'm co-editor on a new collection on the ICU, which brings together scholarship about the ICU in Namibia, Zimbabwe, new ways of looking about the ICU in South Africa. For example, how it dealt with something very topical today, question of immigrants, with new work on the ICU and women. And these are important aspects. So this particular paper, however, is not from that book. It's from another book I'm working on, where we're looking at radical encounters. In other words, how different political traditions in colonial and semi-colonial and post-colonial countries have intersected. Right, so with that in mind, a lot of my focus here, there's a lot about the ICU, and I'm happy to take a whole range of questions about it afterwards. I've worked on the archives of the ICU, that archival material on the ICU in Zimbabwe, Namibia, Zambia, South Africa. And there's a lot. It's a complex organization. It's incredibly interesting. My focus here is going to be to sketch out the ICU and to talk a bit about its politics. All right, so the ICU, we're first going to look at the context in which it emerges. I think it's very important to understand that the ICU was made by a particular moment in the development of the political economy of Southern Africa and the way in which the working class was being constituted and reconstituted, and a very particular ideological and political world in which it emerged. I want to talk about the size of the ICU and its regional dimension. Now, when I say regional dimension, I mean in Southern Africa. This is something that's generally been overlooked. We can maybe explain this as a result of a certain methodological nationalism, where we assume each country has a neat, discrete history. And in each country, there's a story, whether it's a liberation story, or the rise of the trade unions, or the making of the South African working class, whatever. And the problem with that sort of methodological nationalism is that it makes it very difficult to understand processes that go across borders, struggles, identities, and developments that don't neatly fit the container of the nation state. In other words, we're often very anachronistic. It seems self-evident to us now that there is a discrete place called South Africa, and it seems obvious that there is a neat South African history that fits into South Africa's borders. But as the ICU shows, it's much more complex. And there's a lot we lose if we just look at the ICU as part of the story of South African trade unions or South African liberation history. Okay, so the importance of the ICU, I think I'm going to spell that out, and I'm not going to touch on it now. One of the obvious things, it's a really big movement, but there's a lot more to it than that. That will bring me to the main thing I want to focus on, which is really about the politics of the ICU. Now, its politics are very complex, and I'm going to put in a couple of qualifications and try to capture the nuance of the ICU. And I'll also explain what I mean by revolutionary syndicalism when we get there. And finally, we'll look a bit at what happened to the ICU. The ICU history is often written as a sort of a dramatic rise and fall. It's a bit more complex, but there's also some truth to that image of the ICU as something which, sorry, there. All right. Now, for some reason, Dallas, I can't get this floating meetings control to stay off. But in this context, the section, I want to locate the ICU in the context of Southern Africa. And we can only understand that context if we look at a capitalist revolution that took place. And we need to locate it in the processes of imperialism, specifically the British Empire. Now, before the 1880s, most of what we would now call South Africa, there's no country called South Africa. You do get people speaking about South Africa, you do get references to it, but South Africa as a single country does not exist. It's isolated from the world economy. In other words, there's very few minerals that are being exported from here. It's got no manufacturing sector to speak of. Its real exports are fundamentally agrarian, so wool, wine. There's a big craze for ostrich feathers a bit later. That's pretty much where we are. Standard Bank, as you may know, as a South African bank, is actually set up in the Eastern Cape to service wool farmers in the Eastern Cape. But that's really where these economies are at. There's some sugar farming in Natal, but fundamentally, we're talking about a very fragmented region. So there's still an independent, very recently independent Zululand, the Boer republics, there's different British colonies, there's Portuguese colonies nearby. It's mostly rural as well. And I think this explains a lot of what we see there. It's a country where there's not much infrastructure, travel is slow, people are in small areas, quite scattered. Many people, white and black, are pretty much illiterate farming folk. And fundamentally as well, most of what is now South Africa is not capitalist. I don't mean it's socialist. What I mean is it's class divided in a range of ways. And the societies that exist, we could have a long discussion on what they are, but many of them are semi-feudal in character. which is to say they are based on forms of, how would we put it, bonded labor, captive labor, traditional authorities, obligation between classes, and extraction of rent and tribute. And when I say this, I'm including the Afrikaner republics, and I'm including many of the bigger Black African states. So there isn't a point at which, at this stage, South Africa is, what will become South Africa is an egalitarian region. There are some more egalitarian societies than others, but it's already a fundamentally class divided. But the point is it's fragmented. There are many different societies. What really changes this is the rise of modern large-scale capitalist mining, gold mining in particular. Really from the 1880s, you get massive foreign investment in South Africa. A huge gold mining industry emerges in what's now the Witwatersrand of Gauteng. You get the rise in South Africa of the world's biggest gold industry. So really by about 1913, about 40% of all gold in the world is being mined in South Africa. Of course, gold isn't really something you can use for many purposes. Most of it's exported, most of it goes into the banking sector. These gold mines are in turn centralized in a few big, what we call mining houses, which is to say large corporations. As I'm presuming most of you are from Rhodes, you probably know the Bait House here. It's named after one of the owners of the largest of the mining firms, Baron Bait in Eckstein. That was a firm known as Corner House, and it owned roughly 40% of all the gold mines in South Africa. It was a firm based in Europe. So in those days, there weren't really big South African gold mining houses. Gold mining also was coordinated through a chamber of mines, and this allowed the mines to do a whole range of quite dubious things, which we'll talk about a bit later. The thing is, the rise of gold leads to massive urbanization, and this is where we need to start thinking about the ICU again. As I said, what is now South Africa was mostly rural back in the day. This leads to massive urbanization. For example, Cape Town grows from about 45,000 people to 170,000 people in about 30 years. Johannesburg goes from 3,000 people to 250,000 in 1913, making it actually the biggest, richest to that date ever city in Southern Africa and in Africa generally south of the equator. You also get the rise, partly as a result of the mines, of locally owned capitalist farming in the interior. Now, before the rise of gold, large-scale capitalist gold mining, there is some capitalist farming in South Africa. In what was Natal, you had sugar plantations, which relied, as people know, quite heavily on Indian labor. You had in the Eastern Cape wool, and in the Western Cape wine. But what you start to get now are very large capitalist farms in the interior, fundamentally focused on feeding the big cities. Also around the mines, you start to get the rise of factories, making cables for the mines, paint, metals, food processing, and so on. Things that are not really viable to make locally. And you also get with this a massive process of electrifying the country, of building railways and harbors. And a huge amount of this, I should really stress, is done by the state, by different governments. It's not really run by the private sector. Now, running alongside this process of a capitalist revolution that starts to unify Southern Africa, centered on the mines, driven by foreign investment, by creating these large urban centers and transforming the countryside, you have a separate process of state formation going on. Essentially, Britain, and the British Empire as the dominant power in the world in those days, starts to prioritize Southern Africa. Before then, its main interest had really fundamentally been the Cape and Cape Town as a shipping land. But from the 1870s, Britain starts to expand its power. And there are a wave of conquests. The Pedi and Zulu kingdoms are both defeated by the British in 1879, as an example. The Afrikaner or Boer republics are first annexed in 1880 to 1881, but are then also, they are refreed. And then in 1899 to 1902, you have the Anglo-Boer War. Now, all of this is taking place in the context of the scramble for Africa. So it's not just that Britain is coming in, but Britain is also trying to find a way to keep other Western imperial powers out. So, part of this is also, if we think in the Eastern Cape, the end of the so-called frontier wars, which end in 1877. There's the last rebellion and defeated in 1879. So what Britain does through the Colonial Office is they consolidate a range of conquests in Southern Africa. So take the Cape Colony, which was already under Britain, the Tau, which is under Britain, large part of the Eastern Cape, which is under Britain, Zululand, Sekekuni land, and so forth, the Boer republics, and they amalgamate them into the Union of South Africa. And that is essentially the borders and the state under which we still are. This is not a process unique to South Africa. Britain is consolidating colonies in India, in Australia, and Canada. So the founding act of South Africa is in fact an act of the British Parliament. It's the Union of South Africa Act of 1909. So this is very important for understanding a lot of South Africa today. It wasn't that there was an obvious self-evident South African nation, which then constituted a state. Rather, a state was created by Britain, from which we have tried in various ways to imagine and think through and create a nation. It's a very particular type of colony, and this has got a number of implications. It's what's called a self-governing dominion. There isn't just one type of British colony. There's quite a range. There are crown colonies, there are charter colonies, there are protectorates, and so forth. Directly governed colonies, or colonies very often of extraction. This is a dominion, so it's self-governing. It's in the British Empire. The British monarchy can intervene in the parliament through a governor general, but fundamentally it is self-governing within the imperial framework, similarly to Australia or Canada. But at the same time, it's a racist state. So the state that is created through the Union of South Africa Act is one in which you have an all-white parliament, no general extension of the franchise to women or black people generally, a whole range of segregationist laws, which we later tend to attribute to the apartheid government to actually put in place at this stage, including most of the past laws, urban segregation, they put in place in the early years of this state. If you want to read a really good discussion, you could do worse than look at Ben Mogabani's Making of a Racist State. And one of the points Mogabani makes is that this government is fundamentally geared towards enabling the accumulation that is going on in the mines and going on the farms. Now, this new state also sets up its own organizations like banks and corporations. So we mustn't assume that what's happening here is that state is simply a state that is servicing big capital and is outside of the economy. This state is centrally involved in the economy. Many of the things we now know, and many of which are featured prominently in so-called state capture stuff, were established there. The Public Investment Corporation, 1911. Land Bank, 1913. South African Rail and Harbour, which is now Transnet, 1916. Eskom, 1923. And like mining, which is centralized in a few huge houses, these giant organizations, the state also creates highly centralized monopolistic corporations. So, for example, all railway, all the harbors are state-owned and state-run. When South Africa established the National Aeroplane Carrier, SAA, in 1933, again, it's state-owned. There's no space really here for the private sector in a range of areas. The state also starts to actively promote a basic industrial relations system from the 20s and a welfare system, but we'll come to some of the limits of that now. My point here is starts to intervene in the society, not simply in terms of electricity or loans for farmers, but it also starts to try to manage the popular classes. For example, through having a labor relations system that is intended specifically to dampen the effects of strikes. Again, those labor laws from the 20s are essentially what we have now. They've just been expanded in their coverage. But the current LRA is based on a 1924 law. And basic welfare, including the old age pension, that's set up in the 1920s. And the state also becomes more interested in trying to break the British link through industrializing the country, protecting local industry, and fundamentally important to this, using systems that generate cheap labor. All right. There's one last point I want to mention about this process. I've mentioned how you get the rise of a modern capitalist sector around the mining, which has massive knock-on effects, starts to commercialize farming, spur local industry. I've spoken about the state formation that leads to the creation of a Union of South Africa as part of the British Empire and a large state sector, which complements, but is separate to the mines. The other thing is South Africa becomes the dominant power in Southern Africa. And this is still true. It's economically the most powerful, and South African investors and South African-based investors are huge players in Mozambique, Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe. Now, it's a bit anachronistic to use those names. We could use the names at the time, but I'm not going to bother with that. Entire countries, Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, Lesotho, and parts of Mozambique, serve as labor reserves for South Africa. So these are not countries that are being developed with their own industry. But fundamentally, most men in Swaziland, most men in Lesotho will come to South Africa at some stage in their life to work in those days. So we need to understand, again, when I say colonies are different, not only is South Africa a specific type of colony in the British Empire, but among the colonies in Southern Africa, it's the hegemon, it's the dominant force. And in fact, South Africa, the Act of the Union of South Africa does make provision for South Africa to expand by absorbing Zimbabwe. South Africa rules Namibia. It's part of the British war effort in the First World War. It rules Namibia as a colony. Namibia becomes independent of South Africa in 1990. Repeated efforts are made to incorporate Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, and Zimbabwe as additional provinces in South Africa, or as people called it, Greater South Africa. So it's important to also understand then that although South Africa is part of an empire, it's got its own little empire going on. It's got its own little empire going on. And even today, if you look at the economy of, say, Namibia, it's primarily about the export of raw materials to South Africa. And you can go there, you can go in OK bazaars there, and you can pay in rands. So those connections are quite profound and they're quite long lasting. And I think it's always important to remember those today when we're trying to understand issues in South Africa, like attitudes to foreigners. Now, here's where we start to link it into the ICU. Going along with these processes of the rise of capitalism and a capitalist revolution that transforms the economy in South Africa and has massive effects on other countries, for example, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Lesotho, Swaziland. And alongside this process of state formation, we get a massive working class, a massive divided working class. Now, we could have a longer discussion on how these parts, the working class in Lesotho and Swaziland and Zimbabwe and Malawi and Zambia, that fit on. I just want to make some general points here about what the working class looked like in South Africa as a way to look at these bigger issues and as a way to understand the ICU. Everyone with me? All surviving? All good? Okay. So this highly centralized ruling class that is based around these big private corporations, these big state corporations, and a centralized modern state in South Africa rests ultimately on a vast growing working class. Now, to give a sense of how this massive working class is growing and how it's being concentrated and centralized in particular areas, let's look at the Witwatersrand. In 1913, and really we're talking about 30 years after the big gold mines opened up in the Witwatersrand, there were 195,000 Black Africans working on the gold mines. This is it's bigger than the entire population of the old Transvaal Republic, the ZAR, which had been conquered by Britain. There are 43,000 Black Africans working in other jobs, railways, warehouses, domestic service. We have 22,000 white workers on the mines as well. Some of them are doing fairly skilled jobs, electrician, plumber, driller, and so on, hoistman. Others are sort of general handyman. And another 15,000 in other jobs. And again, those jobs are in things like railways, warehouse, factories. But even more than this, in the countryside, there's a massive rural workforce. In 1920, 1 in 4 people in South Africa lives in cities. In other words, in 1920, 3 out of 4 people in South Africa, note I'm not saying South Africans because it's a bit of a complex term in those days. 3 out of 4 live in the countryside. The total population there is just under 7 million. and of those 1.7 something are urban. All right, so there is also a huge number of people. But this working class is very fractured. As you'll know from your, well, I presume you'll know some of this, the idea very often is that capitalism brings together a working class, unifies it by creating similar conditions and breaking down barriers. But this isn't really what happens in South Africa. What happens is this huge working class that is created, by this stage, by far the biggest in the African continent, is deeply divided in very complicated ways. Among whites, for example, there's a big divide overlapping with ethnic or national differences between unskilled poor whites, and who are mostly Afrikaans, and English artisans who are mostly more skilled and mostly are immigrants. And it makes sense. Many Afrikaners have been rural people. They didn't have the skills after they started getting pushed off the land to now start running a flittering and turning thing or electrify buildings. Their skills were those of rural people. There was a division between township dwellers, Black African township dwellers. There's already a permanent Black population emerging in the cities. It's mostly South African, and there's quite a big division which continues well into the late 20th century between permanent multi-generational township dwellers and rural migrants from the countryside who live in hostels. I just want to be clear that these migrants are not necessarily immigrants. In the South African context, a migrant worker is somebody who would come from the countryside, work in the town, and then go back. So places in the Eastern Cape like Pondoland, many men would go work in the cities or work on the mine and then come back, and their kids and their family and their retirement would be in the countryside. And you would maintain a homestead with cattle and some farming, which also made you quite cheap labor, according to business, because they say, well, this is a top-up. You actually are covered. You've got a farm. What's your problem? Okay. But this is quite a big difference between single men living in large hostels and family-based Black urban communities. But there are divisions even within these, because there's a massive use of labor from an early stage from outside of what is now South Africa. So if you look at the Black miners that we spoke about, in 1920, nearly 50% are from outside of South Africa, nearly 50%. In fact, the general preference for Black South Africans is not to work on the mines if possible. If possible, is to get an urban job in a warehouse, a factory, or a shop. Some areas are traditionally mine servicing areas, for example, large parts of the Eastern Cape, parts of Limpopo, and so on. But there's simply not enough people coming onto the mines from inside Africa. So the mining houses recruit vast numbers of people from the region, Mozambicans in particular, but also Basotho, just Swazi, to some extent from Zimbabwe, to some extent from Namibia, to some extent from Zambia. But it's not just unskilled labor. There's a huge amount of people coming into the mines that are skilled Black labor, in particular from what is now Malawi, Nyasa land. And the reason is quite simple. Malawi has got a huge mission education system, but no jobs, no urban modern jobs. So right through Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa, you find so-called Nyasa clerks and skilled Nyasa workers in townships, on mines, and so on. And this actually leads to conflict, by the way. There's actually xenophobic, as we call them now, riots against Nyasas in the late 1920s in South Africa because of the competition for jobs. But I don't want to get too sidetracked. My point is a very divided working class. And when this working class starts to organize, its organization reflects these fractures. These workers don't all come together in one union by any means, rather they tend to organize along existing fractures. Now, last thing I'm going to say on this is the economy is essentially based on cheap Black labor. Although there is a significant white working class, colored working class, Indian working class, fundamentally the core of the economy is Black African labor. And it's provided cheaply through a range of mechanisms. Many of the racist laws we tend to associate with apartheid are already in place, and these help to drive down wages. For example, the pass law system means that people cannot easily just change jobs. They are funneled into employment in particular areas, and they've got very little time to choose their jobs. They're excluded from most labor laws. So although South Africa does allow trade unions access to industrial courts, protected strikes from 1924, and it doesn't mention race in that act, it does say that employees do not include pass-bearing natives, which are most Black African workers. Similarly, the welfare system is open, but most Black people are excluded, and those who are included, like colors, are included at a much lower level. Contracts on things like the mines, government, make it illegal for Black workers to strike in most cases. It's treated as desertion, which is a criminal offense. So sometimes if you go on strike, you're then sentenced to do your job without pay. Okay. There's a range of racist practices, unequal wages. This migrant labor system, as I indicated earlier, provides cheap labor because people are not supporting, in theory, a whole family in the towns. They are being supported by a family in the countryside. A job color bar limits what jobs Black people can do. The maximum average system was essentially an agreement by the mines not to pay wages to Black workers above a certain level. Okay, this wasn't hidden stuff, this was a formal decision. The maximum average system was to stop mines competing for workers by raising wages for Black workers. So they essentially put a wage ceiling, a maximum wage, if you like. Okay. And on the farms, you have various systems of coercive labor. Now, the ICU. Now, the ICU, I think, has to be understood in this context, but it's born in a very particular moment here. The first thing is this growing working class in Southern Africa, not just in South Africa, is actually quite militant. White workers form many of the first unions. Trade unions in South Africa go back to 1881. And some of the very first unions, by the way, are in Eastern Cape, in Garveyite, in PE, and in Cape Town, 1881. Mozambique, white workers formed unions from about 1901. Zimbabwe, 1913. Namibia, 1914, German workers set up trade unions. You get some racially mixed trade unions, especially in the Western Cape, especially for colored workers. In Mozambique, especially for assimilado and mestizo workers. But Black-based trade unions start in the 1910s, and the ICU is part of that. So the first Black African-based unions, it's not to say there were never Black Africans in other unions, but the first Black African-based unions start in 1917 with a union called the Industrial Workers of Africa. And I'll come back to that union. It's an important part of the ICU story. The second thing, so Black workers are starting to organize in the 1910s into unions. The second thing is from the 1910s to the early 1920s, there is a massive strike, not just in South Africa, but across the whole region. Okay, and this involves workers of all races, not necessarily striking together, let's be quite clear. In Angola, there's a massive strike in 1923 on the railways by white workers, which is put down with the army. In Mozambique, there are mass strikes, 1917, 1920, and again, 1925 to 1926. Again, those ones in the mid-20s are crushed with the army. In Namibia, there's a big strike rate from 1919 to 1920, especially on the diamond fields in the south. South Africa, we've got the best data for this, but we know that there were 205 strikes in South Africa over 6 years, involving 178,000 workers. That included 46,000 Black miners striking in 1920, which is the biggest strike by Black workers on the mines until the 1980s. That's massive. Without a union, went out, closed down almost half of the bar strike. 1922, white workers in Gauteng go on a general strike. It drags out more than a month, and they launch an armed insurrection. What I mean by this is not that they start, fighting with police. What I mean is they have already organized their own army of commandos, militia. They storm police stations, jail the police, and start to try to declare some sort of republic. The army is sent in. Parts of Johannesburg are bombed from the air using biplanes, cannon. The leaders are hanged. 3 leaders are hanged. So the working class is on the move in these days. It's on the move. Okay. And in Zimbabwe as well, you have massive strikes, 1919 and 1921. 1921 in Zimbabwe is similar to the Rand Revolt, except the white working class is completely defeated. They're locked out for about 6 weeks and the union collapses. Okay. Now, this is the context where the ICU is founded. It starts in Cape Town, as the poster said, in 1919. It's really at the start a union of primarily of colored workers. Must also bear in mind Cape Town in those days is only about 10% Black African. The vast majority of the city is white and colored, but the largest part of the working class are coloreds. Okay. These are mostly workers on the docks. The ICU is not the first Black trade union. It's not the first colored trade union. It's one of a wave that starts with the industrial workers of Africa. The other unions set up in Port Elizabeth, Bloemfontein, and elsewhere. In 1919, the ICU really becomes famous. It has a big strike on the Cape docks. It's a bit of a funny strike. There are two demands. The one is stop exporting food. Now, the reason was that food prices were going through the roof and many workers blamed exporting food. They said, our food is being sent away, we don't have enough food, the prices are going up. But it was also about higher wages. It's joined by the IWA, the Industrial Workers of Africa. ICU being mostly colored, the Industrial Workers of Africa being mostly Black. They're able to close down the docks. They even get a bit of support from white trade unions. Okay. In 1920, the ICU helps convene a meeting where all of these emerging Black and colored trade unions come together in Bloemfontein. The ANC sort of sponsors this meeting, but doesn't attend formally. This brings together almost all of the new unions that are emerging. There's a lot of fighting, who's the boss, what are we going to be called, and so on. But this merges these unions, the Industrial Workers of Africa and these other unions from Port Elizabeth, Bloemfontein, and elsewhere, under the ICU banner. Okay. The ICU then declares one of its primary aims is one great union south of the Zambezi, not south of the Limpopo, south of the Zambezi. So we're taking about 1,000 km higher. So it's clear from the start that the ICU does not intend to be a union just in South Africa. And this is hard to imagine. We had a general strike yesterday by the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the South African Federation of Trade Unions. The ICU is the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa. And when we look back with these categories, South African, Zimbabwe, it seems so obvious. The ICU was quite explicitly saying that we're not confining ourselves to one country. Our project is bigger. And you can get other ICU statements which say we're going all the way to Cairo. So the ICU is ambitious. It is not neatly nationalist. They do refer to people as South Africans or Southwest Africans, but it's not that central to their politics. Fundamentally for the ICU, the idea is that the giant of Black and colored labor, upon which the South African economy and the Southern African economy is built, needs to wake up. So here's the image of Samson, which was a painting at the ICU's Workers' Hall in Johannesburg, breaking the chains, tearing down the house. The ICU cartoons as well, where they show the chains as white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism, cheap labor, race prejudice. So a very strong image of the giant must awake, the giant has arisen. Now the ICU spreads in South Africa quite rapidly. Before 1925, look, it's fundamentally a union in the Cape Province, especially in the Western Cape. It's here, it's in East London, PE, and so on, Quebec. But it's fundamentally in places like Cape Town, Worcester, and so on. But from 1925, it breaks through into the rest of the country. It goes into what was the old Transvaal, the Free State, and Natal on a massive scale. And it changes as well from being a primarily colored union, as it had been in its early days, to a primarily Black African union. Although it sets up sections in most of the big cities, your Durban, your Cape Town, Johannesburg, these become important to the union. Cape Town is always central, although it becomes less important. It also goes into the smaller towns, the dorps as well. By dorp, I mean those small farming kind of towns in the middle of nowhere. By a smaller town, I mean somewhere like King Williamstown, Queenstown. And it goes onto the white-owned farms. This is really the first, and pretty much in terms of evidence, the only trade union movement in South Africa that has really got somewhere in the farms. COSATU has been trying since 1985, to organize the farms. It has almost no base on farms themselves. It has some base in food processing factories, some base in a few of the industries, say plantations, but this gets onto the farms. So as one example, there are more ICU members in King Williamstown than in Bloemfontein or Durban. And all these little towns you see around here and we often think are outside the mainstream of politics, they become absolutely central to the ICU. This is the hub. So it's around these towns and in the white farmlands around them that the ICU really takes off. It even spreads into what we then call the native reserves, the so-called homelands. So the ICU is deep into the Transkei. In Zimbabwe, and we'll talk about later, the ICU is deep into the so-called tribal trust lands. And that even means some chiefs join. Sometimes the entire village and the chief will join. You get cases where chiefs say, signing up the village, we're in. So this is a photo of an ICU rally. Now the rally becomes central to the ICU. The ICU does not organize in the factories. It never gets onto the mines in a big way in South Africa. It doesn't really organize the factories. It organizes in the countryside and in the township. And the big event in the ICU is the mass rally of 3,000 or 4,000. These are not occasional things. These are done on a weekly basis. And these are long and they're entertaining. The ICU will sometimes have a meeting 3-4 hours with fiery speeches. We know what a lot of these speeches are because the police always monitored them and took detailed notes. So the ICU would play to that as well to be as shocking as possible sometimes. Look, this is one of the strengths of the ICU in that it was able to bring people together who were often isolated. This is in the countryside. From dozens of farms, people would come on a Sunday and they would meet in thousands and talk politics. So it created a bit of a popular counter public. It brought people together. It also meant, because the ICU was big on meetings, people could raise many issues. And a lot of what the ICU did actually had nothing to do with the workplace. The ICU was very involved in township issues around overcrowding, schooling. There were restrictions on alcohol for Black people. So many women brewed beer. ICU was heavily involved in that sort of thing. It also meant, because they were based heavily in townships, you could reach groups that are not easy to reach through the workplace, domestic workers, as an example, the unemployed. So the ICU was more a general union. It wasn't organized around, say, a mining union or whatever. Anyone could join. Okay, there are problems with the model as well, which we'll come back to later. But using the same basic model, the ICU also spreads, and in line with its aspirations, the ICU also spreads across Southern Africa. It's in Namibia by the end of 1920. It starts off in a town called Rhodes, which is in the center of the diamond fields in the south of Namibia. It's in Swaziland, or Eswatini, as it is now, in Zimbabwe in 1927. Even before then, you get people from these countries coming to ICU conferences saying, help us out, come on. ICU newspapers everywhere in the region. It's illegal in a number of countries. In Malawi, there's an ICU supporter called Issa McDonald, who's locked up for getting an ICU newspaper, locked him up for a couple of years. So it's all over the place. In 1928, it's in Lesotho. This one's fairly easy because it's very strong in the rural Free State, and there's a big overlap at the border. And their main organizer in the Free State, Kiabo Boti, is actually from Lesotho. In fact, the national leader of the ICU is from Malawi, Clemens Gadani. In 1931, the ICU is established in Zambia as well. So you can see by this stage, by the late 1920s, the ICU is on track to be in about 6 countries. It's got influence elsewhere. It's got readers elsewhere. For example, there's a guy called Dirk Koza in Mozambique who's in touch with the ICU. He's trying to promote it. It doesn't take off. Malawi, there are a lot of supporters, but there's not really much base to set up a trade union in Malawi. It's not really a country where there's large-scale capitalist farming, industry, or anything like that. So in 1927, the ICU in South Africa is claiming to have 100,000 members. Now, usually when a union says it's got this many members, you take it with a pinch of salt. You say, well, that's too high. And it's kind of hard to judge with the ICU because it's very, it's a bit slopshot in how it organizes. It doesn't have great records or admin. It can be at a rally and 1,000 people will just sign up and buy the ICU card and pay the shilling. In one case, so many people join that they have sacks of money, which they send to head office. It takes 2 days to count it because it's all the pennies from people's pockets. So something like the ZCC at Moria, where a load of people are just putting down money and signing up. And it has almost that character of like a revivalist religious movement in some areas. But the funny thing is the number's too low. Latest scholarship, serious academic studies have indicated, and I think Dave Hinson's one of the people who's joined us online. In his PhD, for example, he gives a figure of 200,000. And that's for South Africa. And a similar figure has been given by other writers, Helen Bradford and others. Now that's huge, okay? That's the biggest black trade union movement before the 1940s. In the 1940s, we don't reach 200,000. It's in the 1980s that you get this big again. It's 3 times bigger than the South African Trade Union Congress, which is otherwise the biggest union movement in the subcontinent, a mainly white union. In fact, the ICU tries to join the Trade Union Congress, but it's too big. The Trade Union Congress says, if you come in, you're just going to be able to run the Congress, so it's not going to happen. We've got unions of 1,000 people, not letting people. But we also need to compare it to other forces. For example, the Communist Party of South Africa in 1929 is 3,000 members. 200,000, 3,000. The ANC, the African National Congress, is no more than 4,000 members before the 1940s. We tend to assume, and if you've gone through a school history book, you will always assume everything was about the ANC from day one. It was this huge movement. It was the big dog. Unions were kind of around. The ICU was vastly bigger. It vastly more branches, vastly more famous. You can go look at Parliament in the 1920s. People barely speak about the African National Congress. None of this is not to say the ANC was not important, but the ANC in those days was a very small movement. And this also explains partly why the ICU didn't have much interest in allying with the ANC. For what? To bring in what? It approaches the ANC several times, said, we're calling a general strike, we'd like you to come on board. But fundamentally, the ICU is qualitatively larger and more influential. In fact, if we want to compare it, we can look at another mass movement of those days, Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Now, Marcus Garvey was from the Caribbean. He built this powerful movement, UNIA, and African Communities League, and this really spreads in the 1920s worldwide. It's in Namibia, it's a really big, it's in Zimbabwe, it's in South Africa, it's influenced in Mozambique. And UNIA is a massive movement. If you know Du Bois, he was a strong critic of Garvey, who he said was essentially a bit of a fraud and so on. And Du Bois organized rival Pan-African congresses against Garvey. But Garvey was huge. He was huge. But the enrolled membership of his organization in the entire world, that includes your Brazil, your USA, you're talking about huge black populations in the Caribbean, was 300,000. So the ICU in 6 countries was nearly the size of the much more famous Garveyite movement. So we're talking about something quite considerable. It's a mass movement, but it's largely forgotten today. 100 years since it was founded, a few years ago. Its imprint was massive, but it's largely forgotten. Now, why does the ICU emerge? The first thing is the working class has grown, and there's a centralization of the black and colored working class. What I mean by this is that many workers being brought together in big townships, in big hostels, on mines, in cities, and there are big employers, government, like docks. Many ICU strikes are actually against the government. Docks are a big thing, railways are a big thing, but also big private employers, diamond fields, for example. So one of the reasons the ICU is rising here is that the working class is much bigger, but it's not just bigger, it's being brought together. It's much easier to organize people if they stuck together in the ghetto, if they concentrated 5,000 men in a hostel, people working in a docks location in Cape Town. There was a specific township just for the docks in Cape Town, the docks location. So that helps. Secondly, the farms are being restructured. As I mentioned earlier, as South Africa goes through its capitalist revolution, the farms of the interior move from a sort of semi-feudal, low productivity model, which is not really about producing for sale beyond a certain limit, to a capitalist model. And one of the big features of this is in the 1920s, the big farms are trying to force black and colored to live on the farm, who rent part of the farmland, labor, tenants, sharecroppers, and other types of tenant farmer into working directly for white farmers. Okay, so you've got to think about it this way. In the 1910s, although black people can't own land in most of South Africa, a huge amount of white-owned farmland is rented by black and colored people. Okay, they may pay for it by giving a share of their crops to the owner. They may pay for it by some of their family doing work for the owner, but they don't work directly for the owner. But in the 1920s, one of the effects of the Land Act is to ban most forms of renting. People think about the Land Act as fundamentally about delineating literal ownership of land, but a huge part of the Land Act is to prevent black Africans renting white-owned land. And this starts to kick in the 20s, this legal thing, and alongside that, the bigger farmers want direct control over the labor process and large-scale capitalist farming. And you don't need to carve out your land to a bunch of tenants who you hope will deliver. So this means many people are being threatened, their lives are being turned upside down, many are being evicted. At the same time, there's a broader mood of hope. It might not seem it. I mean, it seems like a really grim period in the world. There's, you know, you've had the Rand revolt. I mean, you must think what the ANC in that thought. They said, look, if Jan Smuts will murder so many whites in putting down a strike, what's he going to do to us? If you will hang their leaders, what will he do if we go on strike? We've had the Bullhoek massacre near Queenstown. You've had Bondelswarts being put down in Namibia. So there's a lot of repression, but weirdly, people are actually more optimistic than they are these days. These days, people have more freedom, but they actually have much less hope. In those days, there seemed to be a sense that the world could change. There'd been the Russian Revolution. There'd been massive anti-colonial uprisings all over the world, armed rebellion in Ireland, India, in Egypt. Egypt actually starts to get almost a dominion type of status in the British Empire. So there's a lot of hope. People really think the world can change. So that feeds in. It's not just that people are angry and being hammered, but they also think that a new world is possible. And you really get the sense very strong with the ICU, almost a millenarian, the millennium. When I say millenarian, the millennium is coming. Things are going to get better. The Jubilee is arriving. The ICU is also able to connect up workplace and township issues. This is very important. It's incredibly difficult for black workers to organize at the workplace in those days. But the townships are almost a law unto themselves. So it's possible to have mass rallies and they're to reach many, many people and many, many groups. In this book that's coming out next year, there's a paper, for example, by Nicole Ulrich, who looks at the ICU in Bloemfontein and the way it raised issues that affected women. Although the ICU, she says part of the problem is the ICU thought too much like a trade union. And many of the issues weren't necessarily wage issues, they were issues around the household and production and the conditions of social reproduction. But they were able to connect to those. They were able to connect. People would go to the ICU with complaints about leaks in the road, all the way down to being short paid by your boss. And this also meant they could connect to a wide range of oppressed groups, not just factory workers, people being pushed off farms, people in the deep Transkei, black women. All right. So look, the ICU here, in other words, was one of the biggest black or colored revolts in the whole region, Southern Africa, up to South Africa before the 40s. It's the biggest union movement for decades. It pioneered a type of non-racial unionism because it was very explicit. It wanted blacks and coloreds primarily to unite. It even recruited some white workers and some Indian workers. But just bridging the gap of black and colored was a huge thing in places like Port Elizabeth or Cape Town. It was a huge thing. That divide is still something reflected in unions today. It had a massive unmatched rural base in both South Africa and Zimbabwe. It went into the countryside. It got into the so-called native reserves. It was regional, and this is something almost unique. Yes, trade unions in South Africa do communicate. COSATU communicates with the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions. But to actually have literally a union that is in 4 countries. As an example, the Zimbabwe ICU was expected to transfer 20% of its money to head office in South Africa. An amazing thing, the type of globalization from below. I mean, this is the thing unions now are trying to look at, how do we organize across borders? I mean, one of the amazing things, Henry D. writes about this, is they even proposed at times there should be one minimum wage, not just for South Africa, for the region, so that immigrant and local workers would get the same wage, And then employers couldn't choose cheap labor over local labor, and people wouldn't fight about it. If everybody had the same rights and the same wage, then they would actually be united and they'd be easier to organize. That's quite cool, right? Like, think about it today. South African jobs go overseas because South African labor is too expensive. Actually, are we too expensive, or is labor elsewhere too cheap? What happens if China, Vietnam were subject to the same minimum wage as South Africa? Business couldn't just go there for cheap labor. There'd be a flaw. So they actually thought about this in the 20s, and that's pretty amazing stuff. So what I'm getting at, it's a very creative movement. It's a very big movement. It does a lot of important things. Now, what's its politics about? What enables it to do this? Look, talking about ICU politics is a tricky thing because ICU politics are a very complex mix. I call them an unstable mixture. There are many elements in there, and you can shake it up and go in different directions. So it draws on a range of things, and at the same time, it shifts a lot. It even contradicts itself at times. So what you hear from the ICU in one meeting from one speaker may be different to what you hear from the ICU in another meeting. In the ICU's own newspaper, the Workers' Herald, before that, the Black Man, later successor papers, different articles will actually say quite different things that don't fit. And I'll give you a few examples. Sometimes the ICU will talk about international working class solidarity, non-racial, and sometimes Black solidarity, regardless of class. So on one side, ICU says, we want one big union of the global working class. We don't care about borders. We don't care about race. And it even tries to join the South African Trade Union Congress. It literally tries to join a predominantly white union federation. Can you get that on the one side? On the other side, the ICU will say, Africa for the Africans, the triumph of the Black man over the white man. We're not going to be an equal community. We're going to be top. So those are two very different messages. Like, who do you ally with? How do you mobilize? What are your slogans? They're quite different. Similarly, sometimes the ICU would talk in fiery revolutionary language. For example, when I give these quotes, right, they're either from an ICU speech or an ICU newspaper or an ICU pamphlet. Okay? And here's one. If other workers were freed by revolution, then they, meaning in the meeting in South Africa, must also adopt the course. They're pointing to things like the Russian Revolution. If they had an American Revolution with George Washington and they had a Russian Revolution with Lenin, maybe that's a damn good idea. Let's do it. On the other side, the ICU said, no, we're not with the communists because they are political murderers. We wouldn't do that. We will constitutionally overthrow capitalism. We're cool, don't worry about it. So you see these kind of different notes. It's quite a weird thing. So we talk about politics, ICU. This is the politics, this mishmash of different ideas. Working class solidarity, racial solidarity, revolution, moderation, and they coexist. We take this thing off, okay. Similarly, the ICU will say, we will never work with a political party. Resolve, 1925, unreservedly to dissociate ourselves from any political party whatsoever, unreservedly. And at the same time, the ICU worked with Malan and Herzog and the National Party to get them voted. They were still black and colored voters. They mobilized people to vote for the National Party in 1924. And the National Party gave them money and printed a free election vote NP issue of the Workers' Herald. This is very contradictory stuff, right? So their politics are kind of all over the place. Anti-party, some who work with the ANC, hell, you can actually get letters between the ICU and Milan and the ICU and Herzog. They're very nice to each other. Very nice. Very polite. One of them, Herzog, even says, the black Afrikaner and the white Afrikaner must stand together against the English. So there's all sorts of things going on here. And it changes over time. Okay, so I thought I'd give you a picture. So here are two famous ICU leaders. Standing guy is AWG Champion, who was a mine clerk based in Durban and led the ICU in Natal. And he's actually active into the 60s, by which time he actually is an Inkatha supporter after a stint in the ANC. Sitting is Clemens Kudali, who was the most charismatic and founder leader of the ICU. He could not speak any local languages. He was so charismatic that in deep rural areas where they could only speak English, he could hold a rally of 5,000 people spellbound, standing with his bow tie and that, speaking along. Yeah. So the ICU was a bit of a mishmash. A lot of day-to-day ICU activity It sounds incredibly radical, but a lot of day-to-day activity. ICU was in the courts a lot. They loved litigating. They spent vast amounts of the budget on law cases. For example, Champion did a law case against laws in Durban that insisted that there was a scare about some sort of disease, and the Durban City Council was having black people dipped in antiseptic before they came to town. He defeated that in court. It was a law blacks couldn't walk on the pavement. He defeated that in court. So they did a lot of that. ICU and Joburg had a research office, and they would take grievances to the mayor and advisory boards and that. So that was a lot of what they did. Then they'd also have these huge fiery mass rallies, like an EFF type of rally, like incredibly dramatic and exciting, and that with fiery speeches which would get read out in Parliament, which they got to crack down on stuff. Laws were actually passed to try to clamp down on ICU speeches. Didn't mention ICU, but they were definitely there. Then on the other hand, the ICU would do things like trying to set up its own businesses. So the ICU in Durban set up a clothes factory, not work around, ran like a traditional business. Sometimes the ICU would try to get land by buying farms. So come on, everybody, buy a farm. So you had these odd schemes there. And the ICU, as it is formally, what people say and what people believed about the ICU are not the same. So in 1927, rumors swept across the countryside that on Christmas Day, the ICU was going to seize the white farms and give them to the workers and tenants. So the ICU is not just what it said, but also what people heard. And people heard lots of things, and it got that millenarian character that people thought, look, the ICU was really going to make a revolution. Okay. Now, I just want to say with ICU politics, two things, and I'll unpack the politics a bit. The first thing is, don't think because it's got all these influences, it's just a bunch of influences. If you put a bunch of ingredients into a, if you put a bunch of ingredients into something and mix them up, you get something new. So don't see the ICU as just these ingredients, it's this and that, and they coexist. They mixed up and they changed in the process. So things are reworked and blended. The ICU is influenced by international stuff, local stuff, but it's making them something different and putting them together in new and interesting ways. It adapts its ideas to local contexts, local idioms, concerns. For example, the ICU and the Transkei often invoke the idea of a talking crow that prophesies. I mean, people would put in, they would say, well, look, ICU will raise the spirits of the dead in some contexts. Other ones would say, proletariat unite against capitalism. So they really shifted in all sorts of ways. The instability of the politics, the way they chop and change, is actually partly what defines them. If you go to Casado is a very clear line. Marxism, Leninism, it's worked out. There's whole manuals on what exactly the politics is and what it means by this, and it's workshopped. Here, it's quite freewheeling and it changes. So partly that's what defines it. It's not like the ICU doesn't have a politics because it's unstable. The instability is a central part of its politics. So one should be careful about thinking the ICU has got a simple ideology that's all worked out and it's got a big theorist. I also would say ICU politics is syncretic. What I mean is it merges. I hate this mouse. Come back. It merges and changes discrete traditions. We usually talk about syncretism with churches, for example. As Catholicism spread in South America, it adopted local cultures. If we went to Mexico, a major Catholic symbol is the version of Guadalupe, who is actually depicted as I think an Aztec woman. So that's often what we mean by syncretism, mixing different things into something new. But I would say we can talk about this as a sort of political syncretism. It's merging things and making something new. All right. Now, let's talk about some of the political influences. There's a lot, and we could do a week on this. Depends on which ICU you're looking at, which speaker, which period, which country. But I think we can find a few big ones. And this is where I'm talking about these radical encounters. That there's these different things encountering each other and being reused. Let's do Christianity. Okay, this is usually not highlighted when people look at the ICU. But the ICU continually invoked Christian themes and symbolism and universalism. Like often when people look back now at early Black Christians and the mission stations, they tend to assume missionaries were simply just giving a message that promoted colonialism. But in this case, you can actually see that those same ideas were used, appropriated, and deployed by people to make radical claims. So here's an example of the ICU. Christ, when he lived on earth, challenged the existing order. He was the greatest agitator known to mankind, the victim of the rulers of the Jews. And then they would go on to say, we are in the steps of Christ. We challenge the powers that be. We clean out the temple. We denounce the Pharisees. So they would use that. They would say, this is Champion, who's considered generally a conservative in your ICU. The object of the ICU is an attempt to put into modern language the teachings of Christ. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Do unto others as you would have they should do unto you. But what he's saying the modern language is of this is the ICU's call for workers to take over land and factories. So you use this like something many white co-religionists would see, and you use it in a different way. Is Christ the Christ of the status quo, or he is the Christ of the people, a humble carpenter from Galilee? They're very much referencing that mode. And you can also use this to shame and put pressure on whites. So they say, you're not real Christians. ICU are the real Christians. There's nothing Christian about what you're doing. And many ICU leaders were that. So it's different to the Communist Party, where atheism was an essential thing. Garveyism was another big point. Now, Garvey, as I said earlier, had an enormous influence. United Universal Negro Improvement Association, its newspaper, The Negro World, its project, the African Communities League, these were enormously influential worldwide. You could get those newspapers locally. There were ICU leaders who were hard-line Garveyites. The first president of the ICU, J.C. Gunt, was a Garveyite, through and through, West Indian, meaning Caribbean Garveyite. So they drew on this. Here's an ICU speech. Africa shall be restored to us even by blood. And this was in the context of Africa for the Africans. These other people are aliens, we need them out. It blended into ideas that African Americans would come to South Africa to liberate Black people. And this was a rumor that was associated with Garveyism, but even with parts of the ICU, that a new powerful race of people will come out of the sea and an end will be made of all tyranny and wrong. Sort of an apocalyptic prophecy that people will be liberated. The Americans are coming. They're coming to defeat the whites. They're coming in aeroplanes. So that Garveyite world centered in the US and the Caribbean, translated for many people the idea that Americans are coming to liberate Black South Africans. These modern Black people with high technology, they are coming to conquer the whites here and put a country back in the hand of local Africans. So that's there in the ICU. And this is a big influence on the ICU in parts of Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe. There's a big overlap. And a lot of these ICU business schemes come straight out of Garveyism. Garveyism's got a big thing in those days about Black business. And this feeds into the ICU where they say, oh, guys, let's set up a farm. Let's set up a factory. Okay. Now I'm going to get onto syndicalism. Okay, still alive, everybody. Still alive, okay. Now I'm just going to briefly introduce revolutionary syndicalism. Now, syndicalism is essentially a leftist idea, a left-wing idea. It's not Marxist, doesn't come from Marxism. It comes from Bakuninist anarchism, which essentially, I'll unpack what that means. But this is a different left tradition to communism, Marxism, Leninism. It's different to the leftism you see in EFF or SRWP or SACP or sections of ANC or even PAC and ZAPA. This is a huge international influence in those days, into the 1930s, syndicalism. So it's a non-Marxist revolutionary tradition. It's widespread globally. You can get it across South America, East Asia, it's South Europe, parts of East Europe, North Africa. It's a big thing. And in South Africa, this Industrial Workers of Africa Union is a syndicalist union. Yeah. And so are parts of the early Communist Party. All right, let me get to the ideas. Look, syndicalism basically argues this. It's very straightforward. Political parties are rubbish. Political parties are dishonest. They manipulate people. They divide people into camps so they can get elected. The aim of the electioneering is for the leaders of the parties to get into government and live a good life. And fundamentally, political parties are a way for non-working class people to accumulate wealth and power. So that's step one of syndicalism. Rejection of political parties, which means in turn, rejection of a communist party a social democratic party, a nationalist party. Secondly, syndicalism argues that the state cannot be used. Whereas most left-wing thought tends to think you should use the government to free the people, syndicalism, following anarchism, says the government is part of what oppresses you. Just as people are oppressed in the workplace by capitalists, they're oppressed in their neighborhood by the government. And in fact, the government is often their employer as well. Okay, so they don't believe the government can be used. They believe elections are completely pointless. So if you say you can't use parties and you can't use the government, and people need to understand that people running the government are part of the problem, where does this leave you? Well, syndicalism comes down to this. You need to build mass democratic trade unions to take over, fundamentally. You need to build mass democratic inclusive trade unions across borders. This is a way of organizing the working class as a class, independent of parties, which are bourgeois, the state, which is bourgeois, and the other classes. So the working class's natural organization is about the fact it's a working class. That's the union. The working class the union brings together people despite their politics, despite their gender, despite their race, despite their national origins, together. Now, what you can do through a trade union, according to syndicalism, is you can get people to accumulate power by resisting right now. So immediate strikes are a sort of school of revolution. Revolutionary gymnastics is one of the old phrases. This is where you work out and train. You use those immediate struggles to improve people's conditions, to defend their conditions, but these are fundamentally training for a revolution. You don't rely on courts, you don't go to courts, you don't take it to the political parties, you don't lobby. What you want to do is build a mass popular consciousness. You want ordinary people to understand what's really going on in the world. You want to build what Gramsci would later call a counter-hegemony. You want to build this alternative public where people have a different view to what they're being taught by the government and business. You want to educate people, but you also want to educate them with hard skills. And that the reason for that's important. I'll come back to that. I see Mandy Mazuris was online earlier. She writes about this a bit in some of her work. You need to train people in democracy. Running a democratic trade union isn't just a way of making the union run well. It's a way of training ordinary people to govern themselves without a government. Essentially, you're building, I don't use the word state within the state, but you're building the unions as an alternative political machinery in which ordinary people exercise democracy through shop steward elections, participation, raise their understanding, develop their skills, fight back, and then fundamentally on all issues, not just wages, can be all sorts of things, can be racist laws, can be imperialism. But what you're aiming for is this. You're aiming to get the unions powerful enough to seize the factories, the mines, the farms. This is the end game here. So you're coming from the perspective that you've got to destroy capitalism. You say you cannot use the state to destroy capitalism. In fact, you must destroy the state itself. You must topple those politicians and you must topple those big business people and reconstitute society through a self-governed type of socialism based on trade unions. So these democratic unions you built will then provide the structures that can govern the workplace. So for example, let's say you had a strong radical metal workers union in the car factory. That union would develop people's skills to run things democratically. They would study how their factory works. They would conscientize themselves, and when they were ready, they would take over the factory and run it. So trade unions here move away from resisting by not going to work, which is stay away. They resist by going to work and locking out the employees. Okay, that's the kind of idea. Now, right or wrong, the idea here is you do a revolution without the government, without the state, without a guerrilla army. You do it yourself through mass movements that get people to participate and educate themselves. And the state does not control the economy. This is not like EFF or SACP, where the government must take over this, the government must take over this. You want the working class to take over themselves. So instead of the government owning a farm, the workers on the farm will run and own the farm. And then through these larger union structures, you would coordinate the economy. Does this make sense? Okay, you can't just like run one car factory, you're going to get power. We've got to use that larger union structure to hook up with the power guys, the mining guys, to get the cars distributed. So the idea is a self-managed, council-based socialism, not a top-down thing like you see in Cuba or the Soviet Union, but a directly democratic, stateless socialism. Now, this, I'm arguing, is very influential in the ICU. And the problem when we look at the ICU without understanding this context is we miss this very crucial part of the ICU. And this is one of the things that makes it very different to most later left-wing trade unions. COSATU is fundamentally Marxist-Leninist. It believes a revolutionary communist party must influence a revolutionary nationalist movement for a national democratic society and later a Soviet Union type of society. We can democratize or whatever, but COSATU's model is something like Cuba. These guys are not arguing for that at all. They would reject societies like Cuba, Angola, Mozambique as state capitals. Let's look at the ICU. Here's a speech by Gaddafi. We will give you a damn good lesson, putting a stop to your railways, mines, and harvests and domestic services. Then you can do it without us. The one big union will assist in abolishing the capitalist class. Okay, quite clear. The union is not just going to negotiate with business. It's going to assist in abolishing the capitalist class itself. Well, in reality, only a small body who own practically everything. Our definite objective, this is from the Workers' Herald, is complete control of industry to those who work industries and the land to those who work the land. And when I say it directly, our aim is for workers directly to control the economy. Okay? Through the one big union, which is the ICU. This is champion. The ICU is an industrial organization aimed at industrial and political democracy through the emancipation of the African worker, a cooperative commonwealth. ICU constitution. Between the classes, a struggle must always obtain until the workers through their industrial organization, not the government, the unions, industrial organization, take from the capitalist class the means of production to be owned and controlled by the workers. Okay, so these syndicalist influences help us understand a lot about the ICU that is otherwise a bit mysterious. First thing, the ICU's clear project that it's against capitalism, but it does not really work with political parties in any sustained way. This idea that the union itself can do everything that parties do that is good and do it better. We don't need the ANC. We will do a general strike against past laws. That's what ICU was proposing in 1927. We don't need a political party to solve problems around low wages. We will sort it. If there's a problem around beer brewing in Durban, we will sort it. We're not going to go. If we approach the government, we don't go through the party to lobby. We will do it directly. The ICU's vision of one big union. I'm saying help explain. Okay, there are other ways some of these ideas come to ICU, but they help explain the idea that you should have one union of all workers, regardless of skill, regardless of country, united together in a single one big strike. This view that trade unions are not just about wages and working conditions, but that trade unions are about all things that affect the working class, whether that is bad housing or racism or whatever you like. Okay, I'll take this thing off. Its transnational character. This idea that a union, the thing about these syndicalist unions is they define themselves as part of an international labor movement. So they didn't see their project as in one country. They saw all of the unions in one country as part of a global trade union. And their vision, which is central to the ICU, that we're going to fix everything one day, guys. The ICU will call it a big strike and your problems will be sorted. This vision of the big emancipatory strike, which is in the ICU day of today. The ICU doesn't talk about running in elections. The ICU doesn't talk about the government taking over things. The ICU talks about one day we will have the big strike, and that will liberate Black workers in particular, but the working class in general. And this idea that the ICU was going to seize white farms comes straight out of this. In our big strike, we're going to get the land back. Okay. So in the last bit, I'm going to start to wrap up now. I mean, why was the syndicalism of the ICU ignored? There's a few reasons. I'm not going to get them into much detail. The one is a lot of people who wrote about the ICU didn't know about syndicalism. Back when the ICU was organized, many people understood that it was influenced by syndicalism. But later, this was forgotten. Harry Sampson, who was a leader of the white Labour Party, South African Labour Party, the natives have adopted as their model in forming union one of the most extreme revolutionary types of union in the world, a syndicalist union, more political than industrial. Albert Nzula, head of the Communist Party, the ICU demonstrates pronounced anarcho-syndicalist tendencies. So at the time, contemporaries recognized this, that the ICU is left-wing, but it's not really a communist sort of left. Okay, look, we need to always qualify things. But I think this was later forgotten. I think partly, I'm not going to go into all those things, but I think it's partly just that many people, when they wrote from the 60s, syndicalism had faded. For most people, when they saw this left-wing anti-capitalist stuff in the ICU, assumed it was Marxism and particularly communism. They also then assumed that left-wing influences on the ICU were from the Communist Party, which is exactly what the Communist Party of South Africa, SACP, also argued. So party people forgot, it's just intergenerational. In those days, syndicalism was common, but it forgot. There was a generational break. People then assumed radical left is communism, Marxism, and therefore if it's got radical left, it's got to come out of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party pushed this as well, saying, look, while we were in the Communist Party, while we were in the ICU, it was cool. The ICU expelled the Communist Party in 1926. And if you read any Communist Party text by the Simons, by Rue, by Laruma, or Michael Harmel, Brian Bunting, they will tell you, the ICU went to hell after we were kicked out. It became right-wing. So this collapse of the left into the Communist Party and of the ICU's leftism into communism is part of the thing. And there's a few other reasons. The last one, I'd also say, a lot of scholars spent a lot of time trying to think, what is the ICU? Is it a union? Is it a party? Is it a mass movement? But that question is essentially empty. The ICU was a mass, highly political union. But a lot of ink was spilled on the thing is it really a union? Is it a party? Is it a protest movement? It was all of those in a union form. Does it make sense? So there's a few conclusions I can make, but let me stop talking actually. We can make a few quick conclusions, but let me stop yapping and maybe give you a picture. Let me give you a picture. There we go. There's actually this model. Charles Simpson, known as the mayor of Salisbury, riding on a lorry to a political ceremony in Harare Township with Solomon Mabiani. Actually, was still going in the 50s in Zim. Right, it was the main rival for what later became ZANU-PF. All right, any questions?
First of all,
No, okay.